maybe a tad chillier outside, but it's all warm on Football Insiders as we approach the playoffs in the 3 biggest classes of South Dakota, and the playoffs are set.
We are here.
4 smallest classes. That's Jason Andera. I'm David Brown. We're going to get to all the playoff stuff in a minute, but first, we've kind of had this on and off discussion throughout the year based on how dominant Lincoln has been in AAA. So we decided, or more, you decided to take a closer look at the numbers and decide who was the more dominant team. And again, we know the season's not done yet, but projecting, is it the 23 Lincoln Patriots or the 22 Jefferson Cavaliers? Both undefeated. Again, Lincoln as of right now.
Right.
We know the playoffs haven't even started yet, but you took a look at some of the numbers, and there's an interesting dichotomy.
There's definitely some things that came up that I wasn't expecting, but to be clear, 12-0, 8-0.
Yes, again, so projecting. We're
just doing what you guys at home are doing when you know, I've had several people ask me.
It's bar talk.
Yeah, exactly. Who is the better team? They were so dominant. So we're just going to look deeper into the numbers and find out exactly. Let's start with some of the individuals. And I love what you brought up. Both quarterbacks, USF, heading to USF, right?
Yes, so Talon Ashley obviously is at the University of Sioux Falls now. He's going to play basketball. Tate Schaefer committed to USF, presumably as a quarterback or on the team in some capacity.
Yeah, he'll be a quarterback.
But yeah, both USF athletes. Talon Ashley, obviously maybe a bit more of a runner than Tate Schaefer, but Tate Schaefer a bit more of an accurate passer.
Yeah, Schaefer's had a more accurate year. He's thrown more touchdowns per game. They've just thrown the ball in general more than the Jefferson team did last year. It's funny how Talon Ashley's junior year, he was more relied on to throw the football, and then as a senior, they had games in hand so often that they would really tighten the reins on the throwing. But Ashley still threw 66%, almost 200 yards per game, only 3 interceptions on the season. Tate Schaefer only 1 interception so far in the season, so very similar numbers there too. They're taking care of the football.
They are. When you look at the running game, however, you kind of mentioned it, because Tate Schaefer and those receivers are so proficient in the passing game, it's not a knock on the Lincoln running backs. Jefferson just ran it a little bit more.
They ran it more, and they depended more on Nelson Wright. Nelson Wright got hurt a couple of games during the season, and you could tell the production really dropped off for them. He was a beast, over 130 yards per game rushing. Lincoln, however, has a 3-person backfield. They can rotate it a little bit more. They've got a star in Hodge for sure. He can run the football at an alarming rate and does a great job in the red zone, but they don't rely on that as much. So it's really hard to compare those two. And then their main receivers, both D1 bound.
Yes, so Griffin Wilde, as you know from Jefferson last year, is an SDSU Jackrabbit. Jack Smith from Lincoln this year will be a future Jackrabbit. And you look at the amount of receptions and yards per game, it's about pretty even between these two, even though Wilde, is a taller on the outside guy. Jack Smith, you can kind of put him anywhere, a bit of a smaller guy, but no less effective.
Yeah, exactly. Both take games over. Jack Smith does it in a little different way. He'll make big plays down the field, but Wilde always made big plays down the field. But then you've got Jack Smith making more catches per game, going over the middle. He runs the entire route tree. You know, he can go over the middle in the slot. He can go on the outside. He can run in the backfield. He's a little more versatile, but I think Wilde, as the stats show, more yards per catch, more explosive. And he was injured a couple games during the season last year too, so wasn't as durable, but he also brought a huge charge to the team whenever he was in the lineup.
Yeah, when he came back in the playoffs, it clearly gave Jefferson a boost. Not that they necessarily needed it, but having Wilde back certainly helped them. You just look again at the closest margin of victory. It was 17 for Jefferson last year, ironically enough, against Lincoln.
Yeah.
Lincoln, a 15-point game this year against Harrisburg.
Very similar.
Pretty much the same. They've each scored more than 40 points in most of their contests so far. And probably the big one that maybe gets overlooked is the defense. So far, through 8 games, Lincoln has yielded 1 score or less 5 times. Jefferson in 12 games did that 5 times. So Lincoln with 4 more games to hold opponents to 1 score or less.
I think that's a big thing to look at. Let's look at the defense in general while we're talking about how they've held opponents. Lincoln only 11 points per game, Jefferson 12. Of course, that included their playoff games, so we'll see if that comes up a little bit once Lincoln gets into their playoffs. But Jefferson was dominant stopping the run. They had no problem stopping the run. They had, Heiberger in there with team-leading sacks. So they had more sacks. They had better stopping on the run. But Lincoln's been more opportunistic. They take the ball away a couple times a game, a little more often than Jefferson did.
And when you look at just the compare and contrast in terms of point differential, Lincoln averaging about 52 points this year, a little more than 52 points a game this season, and the defense in terms of points per game given up roughly the same. So the differential for Lincoln, amazingly enough, is better than Jefferson. And we talked about how dominant Jefferson was last season.
They were so dominant. Lincoln still has Aberdeen, their AA opponent, on the schedule. A quarterfinal game, which they should walk through, so they could even increase that point differential over this next couple of weeks here. Just really interesting to compare all these numbers, and in the end, two really dominant teams. But Lincoln, on paper, looks as dominant or more dominant than last year's Jefferson team.
They do, in terms of both offensive production and then defensive prowess in terms of takeaways and points per game allowed. But as we mentioned, Lincoln still has 4 more games to go to complete this perfect season. But, we thought, why not now ahead of the playoffs? Because we're going to be focusing on the playoffs in the next couple of weeks.
Exactly.
So anyway, it's just a fun discussion. You can't go wrong either way. Both teams had phenomenal players, have phenomenal players. And we're going to see if Lincoln can match what Jefferson did last season and be an undefeated 12-0 AAA champion. Now to this year. We know Lincoln's going to be the number 1 seed in 11 AAA. There's no question about that. But in what's become a very interesting rivalry over the past couple of years, we have O'Gorman and Harrisburg on Thursday. And in the regular season, O'Gorman has gotten the better of Harrisburg the past couple times. But then they've met in the playoffs, and Harrisburg has always seemed to win the playoff rematch.
Isn't that weird that in the same season, they will split those games? They're very evenly matched, and Harrisburg has risen these last couple of years since entering 11 AAA and really won some important games down the stretch. And over the last 3 years, that's exactly what's happened. This year, O'Gorman comes in a little higher ranked, so what can we make off of this regular season game? I don't know. O'Gorman's on the road. They're in Harrisburg. It's going to be a tough game. The weather's going to be beautiful, so you can kind of throw that part of it out. It's going to be fun, and whoever wins this game on Thursday, doesn't necessarily have the inside track, is what I'm trying to say, for the playoffs.
Yeah, but it could very well determine who is the number 2 seed behind Lincoln.
It will. It gets really complicated. For those of you who don't know, and there's a lot who don't know, just the 11 AAA games count towards the initial tie-breaking seed formula system. So you throw out all those games they played against AA teams. So a win here for Harrisburg would tie them with O'Gorman, and potentially Brandon Valley would be in on that 3-way tie. And it could get very interesting to see who gets the 2, 3, 4 seed. Brandon cannot move all the way up to 2, but they could move up to 3. Harrisburg could be anywhere from 2 to 5, and O'Gorman could be anywhere from 2 to 3. So we'll see how this all plays out.
Yeah, and we'll get to some other scenarios for the lower half of AAA in a moment. But just sticking with O'Gorman and Harrisburg, you look at the numbers, and they're darn near even. They're pretty much averaging the same amount of points per game, giving up essentially the same amount of points per game. Obviously, Harrisburg prone to throw it a little bit more, O'Gorman prone to run it a little bit more. This is going to be a great game on Thursday, and what's interesting, again, is with all these different scenarios we talked about a couple weeks ago, you don't want to have a chance to potentially fall to that 4 spot and have to face Lincoln in the semifinals.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an advantage to being at the 3 spot, or the 2 spot, obviously, is the ideal spot to maybe pave your road to Vermilion a little bit smoother than some of the other spots. And, both of these teams have that opportunity to really create their own fate here and find a way to get a home game, not only in the first round, but the second round of the playoffs.
Other games on Thursday in the season finale, Jefferson and Roosevelt. And you calculated it. If Roosevelt wins, they would jump to 5 potentially.
Super confusing for people because it looks like they're 2 games behind Jefferson. Well, they're only 1 game behind Jefferson. And if they get the win, they would also get the tiebreaker against Jefferson. So Roosevelt actually has the potential to move up to number 5. You talked about, would you rather be at 6 or 5? For a team like Roosevelt, I think they want to be as high as they can.
Sure.
They're probably not looking ahead. So they would love to be in that 4-5 matchup game and be playing their best at this point in the season. Jefferson, on the other hand, interesting. They could go anywhere from that 4 spot to 5 spot to drop all the way down to that 6 spot. And, of course, injury is still hampering these Cavaliers who have not been playing their best over the last couple weeks.
Yeah, Jefferson potentially with a win. They could have a 3-way tie with Harrisburg and Brandon Valley, depending on how Brandon does against Sioux Falls, Washington. The only thing we know for sure is that whoever wins between Rapid City Stevens and Rapid City Central will get the 8 seed.
They will be in. They will be in, exactly. Stevens has 1 win this year, but that's against a AA team. So in class, they're both winless, and the winner makes it to the playoffs and gets a trip to Howard Wood Field next week.
To face Lincoln. So good luck to both Stevens and Central in that scenario. The bottom line, though, is we know a couple things for sure, but let's let Thursday play out, and then we can get into these interesting matchups, just because any way you slice it, you're going to have some interesting 2-7, 3-6, 4-5 games.
I agree. I think we've seen, close games between, Brandon and O'Gorman, Brandon and Harrisburg and Jefferson. So if any of those teams land in that 4 or 5 spot, we'll probably have a really good 4 or 5 game. And I think Brandon Valley, that's right. Brandon Valley has earned a home playoff game. So that's one thing we know. Harrisburg will be at home more than likely in the first round, but wants to be on the road for a couple of rounds. So everybody's got a little bit of juice in this game to try to figure out, their best chance of making it all the way.
Absolutely. And remember, all these regular season games the regular season ends rather, on Thursday for these schools. Let's move to 11 AA. The big headline from last week, Pierre kind of winning an ugly game against T.
A lot of ugly games around the state with the weather.
Well, yeah, the rain and the weather had a lot to do with that. But we talked about it. Even in the loss, this was the game we wanted to see from T. We wanted to see kind of them dominate the game on the ground and kind of use their defensive advantage to give Pierre problems. Again, they didn't win the game. There's no moral victories. But if you're T, you take elements of what you saw in that game and say, okay, this is what we need to do to have success in the playoffs.
I've seen signs of huge improvement for these Titans. As their sophomore quarterback gets more and more experience, their offense gets more and more consistent. Their defense, they've always made a living off of playing defense over the last couple of years, and their defense still continues to hold. They gave up a few big plays in that game, one to Jet Zabel that really cost them. But on the other hand, I see this team improving over the last couple of weeks for sure.
But obviously, Pierre doing what it needed to do. And then this Thursday, we have a big game between Watertown and T, the 4 and 3 teams. And the winner of that game likely will get the 3 seed, which means they avoid a potential matchup with Pierre in the semifinals.
Likely,
potentially,
and that's all likely.
I was gonna lead you into that next point.
Well, let's talk about Watertown first of all. Yes, they have a chance to beat T and to move into that 3 spot, which they would really love that from where they came last year for sure. T obviously wants to prove they can do some stuff too, but you're right. You're just talking about this other element. Yankton is still not eliminated from the number 1 overall spot.
No, they're not, because if Spearfish beats Sturgis the way you've calculated it,
Steve Steele calculated it, just FYI.
Steve Steele. So if anyone's accusing us of bias, just know that the Pierre head coach is the one who told us this scenario is possible. Yankton could technically get the number 1 seed, even though they lost to Pierre in the regular season, because they have a AAA win over Sioux Falls Roosevelt.
So AA is different than AAA. AA seed points all games count. Whether you play up a class, down a class, it doesn't matter. So each comes in with 1 loss. Their seed points on their wins are very similar. They played a similar schedule, but Pierre has Douglas on the schedule where Yankton did not have Douglas on the schedule, so Yankton actually has a higher overall seed point average for their wins. So if they go out and beat Huron this week and Pierre does their job, there's a possibility Yankton could still move to that number 1 spot.
So yeah, the way it was laid out, if Spearfish beats Sturgis, Yankton could get the number 1 seed. If Sturgis beats Spearfish, easy for me to say, Yankton and Pierre would technically be tied. Pierre would then get the tiebreaker because of the head-to-head victory.
Exactly. The power points would tie up. So again, it depends on the records of teams that you beat, and they didn't play exactly the same schedules. And that's why they do it differently in AAA, because they play exactly the same schedule. AA, they play different opponents, so they broaden the field a little bit.
So either way, don't count Yankton out of being the top seed in AA quite yet. So again, that Watertown T game The winner likely gets the 3 seed, and who knows, is that going to be a matchup in the semis with Pierre or with Yankton? We don't know
who knows?
Yet.
So again, I think these teams obviously they're not projecting out to the semifinal round because
we are. That's the fun that we
exactly. But it is important because these teams will tell you they're not, but they are.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, in this case, I really don't think they are because there's still so much stuff that could happen. You can't really plan out a course because you have no idea what's going to happen.
Our last class that still needs a little bit of projection is 11A. Del Rapids dominating St. Thomas More out west. Madison gets its second win in a row after starting 0-6, and we discussed how the Bulldogs, kind of not necessarily snake bitten, but just got off to a rough start. But
great defense lately.
Yeah, they could be a potential sleeper. And then a 2-5 matchup, West Central dominating Lennox. We talked about how Lennox has had some tough games the past couple weeks and losses to Madison and West Central. But you look at it, Del Rapids and West Central, the clear 1 and 2s, but there's some interesting scenarios toward the bottom there.
There's a lot of stuff that can still happen. Sioux Falls Christian will try to punch their ticket to a home field game if they can get by Lennox. And of course, Lennox, like you said, not playing at their best over these last 2 weeks. Their offense has really struggled, and that's the part that was having no problem whatsoever in the first half of the season. So if Lennox wants to get back on track, they have an opportunity to do that. They could earn a home field game still if they can get past Sioux Falls Christian. But Dakota Valley, who knows? All these teams are kind of muddled in the middle. Canton has an easier game. They should get that 3 spot, but anything could happen still on this last Thursday.
Yeah, Canton's at Chamberlain. Dakota Valley's at Del Rapids. That's not going to be necessarily an easy game for the Couriers. But the key one, as you mentioned, Lennox and Sioux Falls Christian, because that could determine a lot in that middle of the pack.
Yep, and if Sioux Falls Christian wins, it's likely then Sioux Falls Christian and Dakota Valley would face off because Dakota Valley, even in a loss to Del Rapids, would move ahead of Lennox at that point, unless there's tons of other crazy stuff that happens on people's records and they get messed up. But the way the seed points project, Dakota Valley, even in a loss, could move up to that 5 spot.
All right, that's the scenarios in 11 AAA, AA, and A. We actually know the brackets now from here on out.
Much easier.
11B. The big headlines from last week, Dual, which we've talked about, undefeated for the first time since 1989. Shout out Swifties. Hot Springs, despite a great season, because of the PowerPoints, they're only the 6th seed.
Only loss too was to 11A Del Rapids, but didn't have enough quality wins. They had some quality wins for sure, but really disappointing for me when I saw the field come out and you see them at 6, you see Sioux Valley at 3, which, sometimes you get these quarterfinal matchups that are just feel like they should be semifinal or even championship game matchups, and that's the way it's looking right now.
Absolutely. Tri-Valley got a big win over Wagner, and then probably one of the interesting things, Rapid City Christian defeated unbeaten at the time, Woonsocket Wessington Springs Sanborn Central, and would you looky here, the rematch 6 days later in the postseason, it's the 7-10 matchup.
And it's crazy because Rapid City Christian was tied with 2 other teams for seed points, but the way it shook out, they draw Woonsocket Wessington Springs Sanborn Central 2 weeks in a row. And of course, last week's game was mucked up, and Coach McIntosh, after the game, I messaged him, and he said, that it's going to be a much different game, even though we're playing the same team. The way these teams will attack are so much different than the rainy, cold game they had last week between a 72-degree game coming up on Thursday. Yeah,
it will not be a 7-0 game this time around. Let's just quickly, I'll just mention all the playoff matchups. And again, all these games are on Thursday the 19th. So the 16-1, Parker against Winter. 9-8 is Aberdeen Roncalli at Wagner. 13 versus 4 is Groton area against Elk Point Jefferson. 12-5 is St. Thomas More at Tri-Valley. 15-2 is Webster area at Dual. We mentioned Rapid City Christian, Woonsocket Wessington Springs Sanborn Central as the 10-7. 14 versus 3 is Mount Vernon Plankinton at Sioux Valley. And then finally the 11-6 matchup, very interesting, Bridgewater Emory Ethan at Hot Springs. When you look at these games and, the octafinals, I guess you would call them, usually they don't produce the best games, but if there's any games that you're looking out for, which ones are they? Yeah,
I think for sure you're right. There's usually maybe 1 or 2 competitive games in this first round for 11B, but you look at Roncalli and Wagner, they tied in seed points this year. They're going at it. Wagner, their only losses to Winter and Tri-Valley, 2 really good losses. Roncalli lost to Dual and St. Thomas More, again, 2 really good losses. So I think that one is very even. We already talked about Rapid City Christian, Woonsock at Wessington Spring. Their rematch should be good. And don't sleep on St. Thomas More. I know Tri-Valley might be one of the better, more underrated teams in 11B.
Yeah, as a 5 seed.
But don't sleep on St. Thomas More. They can come out. They found a way to play with teams this year that they look overmatched, and they're able to play with teams.
Yeah, Tri-Valley's 3 losses this year were to Winner, number 1 seed, West Central, 11A, number 2 seed, and Elkhorn Jefferson, which is a top 5 team in 11B. And then you look
Defending
at
champs,
yeah, exactly. St. Thomas More, they lost to Hot Springs, Sturgis in 11AA, and Del Rapids as well. So they both share a common opponent in terms of losing to undefeated number 1 teams, whether it's 11B or 11A. But that's interesting. And then Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan. I know it's kind of a down year, quote unquote, for the Seahawks, but they just always seem to find themselves in the mix somehow, some way.
You know, last year was the first year they kind of fell off a little bit after that championship run that they had. Were making the finals year after year after year. And the team that knocked them off was Hot Springs in this first round last year, and that surprised a lot of people. It's not going to surprise a lot of people this year if Hot Springs knocks off Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan, but they have to be very careful because they have some talent on that Seahawks team.
Yeah, Hot Springs defeated Bridgewater, Emory, Ethan 45-6 in the playoffs last season, but as you said, if Hot Springs and Sioux Valley advance, that sets up a whale of a quarterfinal. And again, it's based on C points 6 through 3, but both these teams were consistently in the top 5 of the media poll the entire season, and they're going to meet in the quarterfinals potentially.
Yeah, that really, I mean, really, it's the second and third team if you go by the polls. So it's definitely a semifinal type matchup. You hate to see that in the quarters, but I think both coaches will tell you, hey, we're going to have to beat them at some point, and we might as well do it in this round.
Absolutely. Moving down to the 9-man ranks, let's talk 9AA first. The big headline, Platte Geddes defeating Canastota. They continue to just get better throughout the season. They were kind of a little under the radar and then really accelerated in the second half.
Played a lot of close games with some very average teams early in the year, and then they really started pushing the accelerator these last few weeks. And now Platte Geddes, with a signature win against Canastota, they look like a really good team, and they vaulted themselves all the way up to a number 2 seed.
Absolutely. Here are the matchups in the 9AA playoffs. 16-1 is Viborg Hurley against Parkston. 9-8 is Hanson, who we have thought has been underrated all season long.
They go on the road, yeah.
Yeah, they have to go on the road at Leola Frederick area. Bonham is at Hamlin in the 13-4. Kimball White Lake at Wall in the 12-5. 15-2 is Great Plains Lutheran against the aforementioned
How about Great
Platte
Plains
Geddes.
Lutheran, by the way? Good for them.
Number 10, Freeman Marion Freeman Academy at Stanley County. Stanley County as a 7 seed has 1 loss. That's pretty remarkable. 14-3 is Ipswich against Howard. And then the 11-6 matchup is Britton Hecla and Elkton Lake Benton. We mentioned it. 1 through 7 is either undefeated or 1-loss teams.
It's incredible, and before I forget, I'm going to go back to Great Plains Lutheran once. Got a big win, a close game over Hitchcock-Tulare last week to punch their ticket to the playoffs, a team that has not made the playoffs over the last few seasons, so congratulations to them. But you mentioned it, the top 7 teams, 1 loss. I mean, Stanley County comes in with 1 loss in the season and has to play that 7-10 matchup. That could get real dicey real quick.
Absolutely, and then you're looking at just down the line, and again, we're just projecting here, but you look, we could have a potential semifinal matchup between Parkston and Hamlin, which had been the 1-2 teams for most of the season in the 9AA.
Yeah, exactly, and as soon as you start projecting like that, you know, you got Hanson.
Yes, exactly.
In
Hanson,
the quarterfinals that might be having a rematch with Parkston, and that game was close too. But you're right, Hamlin's in there. Wall, the defending champs.
as a 5 seed.
As a 5 seed. I love Elkton Lake Benton and how physical they were. They took care of a really good DeSmet team. Did not let them move the ball last week. I think they're a team that you really have to watch. Howard hasn't lost since early in the season to Canastota. They look like a contender. And then we talked about Platte Geddes kind of coming out of nowhere and earning a number 2 seed. They look like a really strong contender in this class too.
And all these games begin on Thursday, 9A. The big headlines, Woolsey, Weston, and Dubrook, they had a chance to kind of improve their standing, but they lost to 9B teams.
Yeah, and we talked about 9B really feeling like a rung lower this year. Some years it doesn't. It really did, but Woolsey, Wessington, and Dubrook both not able to get wins. Dubrook lost to St. Mary, and Woolsey Wessington was up on Avon all game and gave up 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter to lose. So that's not the way you want to go into the playoffs.
No. Meanwhile, undefeated seasons for our top 3 teams, Warner, Alcester, Hudson, and Phillip.
Yeah, I didn't have that in preseason. I thought Phillip, just with Wall on the schedule, wouldn't be undefeated. Alcester Hudson had a lot of tough games, and they were able to get it done. Warner's the one team, I looked at their schedule at the beginning of the year and said, well, there's no way they're going to get past, Hamlin and Faulkton and all these teams in a row, that gauntlet they had at the end of the schedule. So big congratulations to all 3 of those teams. That is quite an achievement.
All right, here are the matchups in 9A. 16-1 is Coleman-Egan against Warner. 9-8 is Castlewood against Lyman. 13-4 Centerville and Canastota. The 12-5 Gregory, the defending champs, the 12 seed at number 5 Hardin County Bison. 15-2 is Burke and Alcester Hudson. We talked about Alcester Hudson kind of coming out of nowhere to have an undefeated season. Estline Hendricks at Dubrook is the 10-7. Timberlake at Phillip is the 14-3. And then the 11-6 matchup is Chester and Woolsey Wessington. What I look at is interesting just in terms of these 9A matchups. None of the first round games look necessarily all that competitive. All the lower seeds are 500 or lower, but you look ahead and you look at these undefeated teams, and Alcester Hudson, to me, is one of those teams where maybe they were underestimated to start the season. They're not going to be underestimated now.
Yeah, I think, with a 2 next to your name, nobody's going to look past you. Undefeated in the loss column. So I tell you what, that's a team people are not ignoring. Same with Phillip, though. Phillip, they have almost everybody back from last year, and they made a decent run last year. So I think those are 2 teams that have a lot of respect in this class. I think Canastota has a lot of respect despite their 2 tough losses on the season. But I also think the most interesting game in this first round could be the defending champs. Gregory playing better in the second half of the season. We haven't seen it record-wise, but Hardin County, kind of a disappointing loss a couple of weeks ago. Not a huge, signature win for them. I think right off the bat, Gregory could give Hardin County some problems right away in this first round.
Yeah, absolutely. And even as the defending champions, you have some players left over from that team. And even though the Gorillas are not having the best season, as you mentioned, you kind of just never know. Maybe that playoff experience will help them in some way, shape, or form. But as you said, Gregory, they had some early losses. They got knocked out of the top 5 completely early in the season after starting at number 1. But we'll see. Yeah, I think of all the matchups, that one is probably the most interesting just because you do have a defending state champ against the team that hasn't necessarily been playing its best down the stretch.
Yeah, and hasn't had as tough of a schedule. Gregory's had a way tougher schedule than Hardin County. The other one to kind of keep an eye on, too, is Estline Hendricks. That's a team that has improved over last year big time. And Dubrook, coming into the playoffs with a loss against Dale St. Mary. I think those 2 teams could be very evenly matched here in this first round.
And lastly, 9B. And Avon jumps ahead to number 1.
Who saw that coming?
Probably you.
Not me.
Not me.
Not me.
Not you. Okay. Well,
no, I did not. I didn't. First of all, playing Woolsey Wessington, that was a huge win for them. Mm-hmm. Second of all, for them to be able to leap DeSmet, I thought DeSmet maybe had a chance against Elkton Lake Benton
or Faulkton as well.
And then Faulkton, they felt like the number 1 team pretty much all season long. So crazy that Avon with 2 losses jumps Faulkton with just the 1 loss.
Yeah, Faulkton and DeSmet were the consistent 1-2 in the media poll over the past couple of weeks, but Faulkton is number 2 and DeSmet is number 4 actually.
Yeah, that was a tough loss, and it stinks because they played that DVC title game, which a lot of other teams will not play a title game like that, and that really ended up working against them in the seed points. But they're on the side of the bracket opposite of Faulkton. They get a game against Avon if both teams end up continuing to win. So, they probably don't feel too bad being at the number 4 slot.
Let's break down all the matchups. 16-1 is Faith at Avon. 9-8, Lemon McIntosh against the defending champions, Hitchcock Tulare. The number 4 team, DeSmet, is facing Colombe. Gayville Volan is facing Harriet Selby area, the 12-5. Jones County and Faulkton is the 15-2. Kadoka against Sully Buttes is the 10-7. 14-3 is New Underwood against Corsica Stickney. And the 11-6 is Potter County and Del Rapids St. Mary, which was the championship game a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that was the championship game a couple of years ago. Potter County, of course, dropped off a little bit last year, and they started to come back a little bit, especially early this season, this year. But you kind of look at and compare schedules. That's the best you can do at this point. Both played very similar games, not in a good way against Kimball White Lake. So I feel like that could be a really good battle. Del St. Mary seems to always kind of up their game in the playoffs, so I think they're probably the favorites here, but not by a whole lot. And Sully Buttes and Kadoka is the other one. Kadoka suffered a lot of losses, played a lot of tough teams. Their record really doesn't match as good of a team as I think they are. I think Sully Buttes is a little better, but that one could be a really good game too.
Corsica Stickney, by the way, being the number 3 seed, they were kind of hovering in that top 5 for most of the season.
Yeah.
And again, based on the seeding points, they jump up to number 3. They leap to Smith, who they were consistently behind in the media polls. Again,
Right.
media polls and seed points are obviously different depending on the perspectives. But either way, you're looking down the line. You have a potential Corsica Stickney Falcon semifinal matchup. I'm looking at Hitchcock Tulare at the 8th spot. And they haven't had the best season. They've been blown out a couple times. They've been shut out a couple times in some really bad losses. But I see a 1-8 matchup potentially with Avon as something that could be very interesting.
That's a great point, David. I think a lot of 9B coaches looked at the bracket and saw exactly what you saw. Eric Solomon for Hitchcock Tulare is a load. He is tough to bring down. Avon has Isaiah Meyer, who is one of those guys who can probably match up with a guy like Solomon. So 2 big-time horses going at it. That's going to be a primetime game coming up in the quarterfinals coming up next week.
And then another potential 4-5 matchup, you have DeSmet, which again had been kind of consistently number 2. They even got some first place votes along the way, hosting Harriet Selby area, which
Potential.
potentially may not be as good as last season. This Harriet Selby area team, but again, they kind of improved toward the end of the season.
Yeah, this is a team that's totally different than they were early in the year. Don't have as much power as they've had in the past. Not quite as big up front, but they have some playmakers. They can throw the ball a little bit too if the weather's okay. I think that's one thing that Harriet Selby has that a lot of other teams don't, is they can make big plays through the air. So I look for the Wolverines to definitely be a tough out no matter who they play.
It's playoff time, folks. We got it already in 11B and all the 9-man classes. And we're going to have it in 11 AAA, AA, and Single A next week. Next week. It's all going to be the same. Everyone's going to be in the quarterfinals.
Right.
Everything will be nice and copacetic. So enjoy these playoff games and these regular season finales coming up on Thursday. And guess what? We're going to be back next week to break down the quarterfinals in every single class. Final thoughts, Mr. James?
Well, I didn't even ask you. I'm going to ask you on the spot. But every year I make predictions starting in the quarterfinals. If you'd like to join me, you certainly
absolutely.
can. We can go against each other on our picks.
Okay.
So that starts next week. The first round I usually don't do, but starting in the quarters, we will add a little element of excitement to the show next week.
Absolutely. Head-to-head, mano-a-mano. Who's going to have the better picks? Probably Jandy, but we'll see.
No. I mean, the more you know does not make you better at picking games. Trust me on that. But we love to give bulletin board material to you, the viewer.
Do they even have bulletin boards
Oh,
anymore?
yeah. Trust me, I've had stories of my...
do they print stuff from the internet?
They print stuff from the internet.
And then
exactly.
Okay.
It happens.
All right.
It happens.
Well, we will provide plenty of bulletin board material for you next week. For Jason Andera, I'm David Brown. Thanks for watching Football Insiders.
Maybe it's smart board material.
There you go.
I don't know.